Welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today we are talking about Avatar: The Last Airbender, and in particular, the whole plot arc around Ba Sing Se. We're talking about denial and the ability to shut out evil things that are happening outside your walls. We're talking about what is the appeal of that and what is the danger. All that and more after this commercial break we have no control over. Welcome back. My name is Matthew. I'm your host, and we are joined by my original co-host, the co-host, who has been popping in a little bit more these days, Paul Hoppy. Paul, how are we doing today?
I mean, it depends on how broadly you want to use the word we.
Yeah.
I'd say pretty bad. I mean, me, personally, in my house, like, all right, but yeah.
Yeah, for those who are hearing this, we're probably going to publish this a week and a day after we are recording it, because I've been kind of front-loading recordings a bit. So that means that we're recording it while we're still right in the midst of the all the protests over the murder of George Floyd and the cop violence and all the discussions about that. And so it's been my sincere hope, knock on particle board that my desk is made of, that by the time you're listening to this, that we've had a lot of positive steps, and the protests and violence has abated, and things have gotten to a better place. Although obviously it will not be fixed overnight, but it is the place where we're coming from today, and probably something that we'll be talking about a good deal, because as we talk about this topic, one thing that I think the current situation really highlights, what are the dangers of not being aware of just how bad things are outside of your little gate, outside of your little community. So yeah, I am, as you said, I'm kind of doing the same. Things could be better. Things for me are actually pretty good, which is kind of part of the thing that's interesting, I think. Part of what got me thinking about this whole topic.
Yeah.
Yeah. I live inside Ba Sing Se to some extent. I live in suburbia. I'm recording this in my house in the Minneapolis suburbs. I am less than 5 miles from where George Floyd was killed. Quite a lot of the stores that have been burned down and the neighborhoods that have been hit, especially where the police were really going crazy, was all neighborhoods that I used to shop in. I have a lot of friends who are really affected. But I've been totally untouched because, God bless suburbia. So, and it's been something I've been really thinking about. And so I've been kind of, I'm really glad we're tackling this topic, because I think it's very relevant for what's happening right now, but it's also one that's relevant for, all of human history. The desire to kind of, say those things are happening out there, but they're not happening in here, and so we're going to protect ourselves from it. And I know hopefully many of you are big Avatar fans and are eager to listen to that, but I'm sure some of you have not had a chance to watch the show yet. It is still on Netflix. I will strongly recommend watching it. The seasons are not that long. I think you could binge the entire thing in I think it's a total of like 21 hours, 22 hours of content.
Yeah, that's about right.
Which, would mean probably for most folks, taking 2 weeks or so. I've done it in the last 4 days.
I was going to say that's less than a day if you just watch it straight with bathroom breaks.
Yeah, which were not quite encouraging. But
not totally discouraging.
Yeah, we're gonna probably not we won't be spoiling too many exact details, but we are gonna spoil a pretty major plot point that takes up a good part of the second season. So I would say, if you plan to watch it, maybe hit pause and then come back and listen to the show after you finish season 2. Although we will spoil some stuff in season 3 as well, probably. So maybe just hit pause and come back and listen after you finish the whole show.
Just watch the whole series, come back in 22 hours, and then
all this. Or in a week or two. Or I will say, though, if you don't plan to watch it, or you think you're going to watch it at a much later date, so you don't mind being spoiled, welcome along. And we'll now kind of start out by just explaining a little bit what's the plot arc that we're talking about, and why is it so relevant. Paul, do you want to give us a spoiler-filled summary of the Ba Sing Se plotline?
Yeah, basically, 100 years ago, the Fire Nation attacked, and
he's quoting from the opening intro exposition.
Always, they attacked the Earth Kingdom, and I think first they attacked the air nomads and pretty much genocided them, just about. And then they went and attacked the Earth Kingdom. And, the Water Tribe, too. They killed a lot of them. And they conquered much of the Earth Kingdom, so there's Fire Nation all over the Earth Kingdom. It's like the Fire Nation is like this little island nation, and then the Earth Kingdom's this huge, expansive landmass. And they've been making inroads there. And the main, the I guess the capital city, really, of is that a word that you use with the monarchy? I don't know. Anyway, the king and a large number of the people live in this giant Earth King city called Ba Sing Se, and the Fire Nation have been attacking it for a long time. They failed in that. That's a major plot point. Basically, General Iroh, who was originally first in line to take over as Fire Lord, to succeed his father, his son died in the battle in the siege of Ba Sing Se, which is a very lengthy struggle. It's got these enormous walls on the outside and earthbenders on the inside, who I would imagine can just keep fixing the walls pretty quickly. And then Iroh gave up, right? I mean, he turned away from the battle. He turned away from the war. And the Fire Nation apparently for a while gave up on trying to conquer Ba Sing Se. But meanwhile, inside the city, no one in the inner part of the city, not inner city, it's a bunch of rings. The inside ring is like the king. Then there's a next ring that's like the rich people. Then there's a larger ring that's the poor people. And then there's a larger ring that now is like a zoo. And then, thanks to Aang. And then there's a final ring that's like the wall of the outside world. And apparently the Fire Nation never really breached the outer wall successfully. So the people inside have just been lied to and told there is no war in Ba Sing Se.
Yeah. And he says that in a kind of fake sounding voice, because it's not just that they're lied to, it's that some degree of brainwashing is literally occurring.
Yeah, they're Manchurian candidated. Yeah.
We meet a number of characters who will just say that phrase over and over. There is no war in Ba Sing Se, in a way that sounds very kind of, Stepford Wives or programmed.
Yeah.
And we see at various points the idea that it's never really explained, but there's some kind of literal Manchurian candidate that they're able to do, and that certain people can be sort of taken away for re-education and have their minds basically wiped and reprogrammed into these very happy, docile personalities. We have all sorts of things about trying to control what people know, down to our heroes are met with a guide who is Jolie, I think is her name. Judy.
I am Judy. And then she's replaced by someone else who's like, I am Judy. And they're like, wait, what happened to the other? Oh.
Right. Because the original Judy didn't properly hide information from them. So,
she got invited to Lake Laogai.
Yeah. And it's interesting to me because the whole show is about the idea that the Fire Nation are, as you said, the first word, some of the first words in the exposition of the first episode are, and then the Fire Nation attacked. And the culmination battles are all about defeating the Fire Lord and beating the Fire Nation. And yet, I think that if you asked an awful lot of Avatar fans, myself certainly included, and Paul, I get the sense from you as well, who is sort of the scariest, villain? Who's the one that kind of is the most disturbing and creepy, and the fight against them is so important? I think many would say Ba Sing Se, and certainly I would say. Paul, what's your kind of take on why this particular plot arc holds so much resonance for fans of the show and for the show itself?
First of all, I would go with Azula, but
but as a particular individual,
the thing is she's Fire Nation, right? But she also takes over the Dai Li, so there's
the Dai Li being the Secret Service, basically secret police of Ba Sing Se.
Yeah, so they fit her character very well, right? They suit her, and I think what it is it's that's kind of the world we live in a lot of the time. You could be forgiven if you forgot that America has been at war basically this entire century. At some point, you can't be forgiven if you don't understand the horrors that are perpetrated on parts of the population of the United States, particularly black people, at some point you can educate yourself, right? And you can listen to other people saying, you know, there's a war out there, and you can't just sit at home, you know, in your suburbs or in your inner circles of Ba Sing Se and ignore it, because, I mean, you know, it will come to you eventually also, you know, and that's not necessarily the reason you should do something about it early on, but even if you're just entirely selfishly motivated, like, things spread, you know, violence spreads, corruption spreads, and you know, the people inside the city are not safe from the war. They are sheltered from it, but that doesn't make them safe from it. The Fire Nation will break down the wall. They will get inside, and the people inside are not, in the long run, they're not prepared for it, because, you know, their government has lied to them. Their government has suppressed information, and I don't know, maybe the Earth Kingdom could have won the war on its own if they were just like, oh yeah, there's a war going on outside, let's all gear up, you know, and like, instead, I don't know, maybe they've been like grabbing all the Earthbenders from the inside and then leaving everybody, because like, they have an army, right? I mean, they have people defending the wall, so you know, but then they're basically just brainwashing everybody inside. I don't know, maybe because they want the economy to work or something.
Well, and for me, good point. There's a couple of real key points here. One, just in terms of talk, as you were saying about like comparing it to our current situation, part of what got me thinking this is there was a recent article published. I think it was over the weekend that Trump gave this speech. It was right in the heart of when everything was really at the height of how bad things were with the Floyd murder and the protests. And he said there is no racial tension in the United States. And I and a number of other people had this idea. I'm not claiming original credit for it by any means, but a number of us basically all independently came up with the idea of putting up a headline that said some equivalent of, you know, there is no racism in Ba Sing, USA. Because it was that exact kind of thing. But jumping in right away to, and I think there's a number of different ways we can approach it. I think, though, I would somewhat disagree with you on when you say at some point, like, you have to know. To me, I think what Ba Sing Se reminds me of is, cause the thing about what they do in Ba Sing Se is that they do completely control it, and the walls are so thick. Like, it's interesting. You were saying that eventually the war will come to you. Before we even get to Ba Sing Se, we have a couple episode arc about an attempt to attack Ba Sing Se and destroy the walls. So we've seen, as the audience, clear evidence that the Fire Nation is literally right outside their gates.
Right.
And I think that is brilliant writing, because it means that when we get to Ba Sing Se and hear them say there's no war here, it's like, but it's so striking to us.
Yeah.
But it's, you know, that wall is very thick, and no one goes anywhere near the wall because there's like that huge kind of like zoo area, as you said, in between.
Yeah, which wasn't a zoo at the like when they got there, when the Avatar and when the Aang gang showed up.
But it's clear like there's an inner wall, and most of the people are very far away. And to me, what it really speaks to is, and it's a thing that I think in this country especially we're really wrestling with, is how do you reach people who have been so thoroughly indoctrinated by one particular kind of news that anything else seems crazy? Because when one of the things I think is most interesting is when the Avatar shows up and says there's a war outside, don't you know that? Like, nobody believes him.
Right.
And what that speaks to me is about, you know, how do you know, a person who has grown up in a very conservative community and you know, everyone they know kind of believes the same kind of things, and the only media they get is Fox News or right-wing radio or whatever it is. Like, if that's all you know, I think it is possible to think that you're being a very moral person following the moral structures given the information that you've always been told. And I agree with you that I think that there is a need for intellectual curiosity, but also, like, when you're taught that intellectual curiosity is evil and wrong in and of itself, you know, it's a sort of thing where, like, I think that position is completely wrong, but in some ways, Ba Sing Se makes me not sympathetic, but makes it harder for me to demonize someone who's just never been. Right? Yeah, because I think it makes me sort of understand just how pervasive that kind of, like, you know, there is no racism in America, there is no poverty in America, everything is fine here. All those people who yell and scream about it, they're just troublemakers.
Right.
You know, and I will say, like, I think that is much more on the right, but I think there's some extent of that sometimes on the left. MSNBC is becoming a leftist Fox News.
Or the center, anyway. I would just briefly push back on that I think they have a centrist bias, but anyway.
Yeah.
But the American left, if you can call it the left.
Exactly.
But yeah, they definitely have a bias towards a different point of view. And I mean, your point is well taken, right? That I basically just don't feel like cutting a lot of people a lot of slack right now. But
no, that's pretty fair.
Honestly, I think, if you want to call it the left, what passes for the left in the U.S., I think there is a lot of more willful ignorance, right?
Yeah.
And because there is theoretically, a culture and ethic of intellectual curiosity, of trying to understand what's really going on, trying to, believing in science, things like this. But then there isn't really a lot of follow through on everyone's part. And so if you have the exposure, right, it's like, it's not exactly like you're in Bossing, say. But, I mean, if you watch the local news coverage or even just a lot of things, it just doesn't, context matters so much, and it just, I think, doesn't paint a full picture of what's really going on, or the kind of the spectrum of ideas that you could have about what's going on. And so somebody who's basically been told that certain kinds of knowledge are evil, right? Or even that knowledge is evil. And that, that these people are good, these people are bad. And, we have these, we have these ideals that everybody's created equal, and the laws on the books say that. So, like, why are people still whining when the laws say this in their text, right?
Right.
If everyone you've ever been around is saying a certain thing, it's hard to look at it and be like, yeah, but that thing doesn't make any sense. That that thing, but there's the war. Like, how are you saying there's no war here?
And especially, go ahead.
Well, I just like it within the context of Bossing Say, where people are literally being brainwashed. It's like, it's super reasonable. Like, I can't fault the citizens there, right?
Yeah.
Whereas I feel like here, it's like, if you want, you can go find the information. But, if you're constantly told not to, then I understand, like, intellectually, right, why you wouldn't end up doing that.
Right. Yeah, but you're right. It is a difference there. And like, there isn't, the people in Bossing Say don't have the ability to Google the newspaper,
Right, right.
In some ways, to me, it's much more emblematic of kind of like, the way this would happen in pre-internet days. And in fairness,
or in areas. Oh, go ahead. I think you're about to say it.
Yeah, I was gonna say. Well, what I was gonna say is, in fairness, I mean, Avatar is what, 15 years old by now. 20 years old. Like, at the time it was written,
15-ish.
I mean, the internet existed,
10.
but nothing like it did today.
Right.
And so I think it is in that way still a very good, call out of the culture of that time.
Yeah, and I'll add to that there are, internet deserts these days, right? Not everybody has equal access to the internet. And so some people don't have the same access to information just at their fingertips the same way.
Right. Yeah, definitely true. Definitely true. I think also another important part of the plot of what happens in the episode that I think is symbolic for us today, especially in terms of like, how do we learn from this in terms of our own ethics and values and the like, is that our heroes do try to fight and do try to, get the people and the king on their side and to rise up, and they lose. And the reason why they lose is very complicated, and part of it has to do with Aang, our hero's kind of own personal journey, and that this is like the setback that has to really teach him lessons so that he can eventually, sort of overcome that. And part of it's also because of just in this particular instance, there's a whole level of people who clearly don't even care about the Earth King, succeeding or not. They care about their own power. The Dai Li being willing to work with the Fire Nation people and things like that. But to me also, there's, when I watch what happens, part of what I see is, when I see people with the best of intentions thinking, and I think I thought this way for a long time, if we just tell people the truth, if we just go into, spaces with people who are more right-wing and just, we just show them why they're wrong, that of course they'll believe us and they'll come around to our side. And people have been trying that for 15 years and it hasn't really worked. And to me, I feel like that's one of the things I find most genius about this series of episodes is that's what it kind of shows is our heroes, Aang and Katara and Sokka, have this, kind of really beautiful but also naive idea of, we'll just tell them the truth. And of course that will work. And I'm not saying that's wrong, but it's clear, like, I think what the show says is, like, you need to do a lot more than that because that brainwashing does go very deep.
Yeah, it says it's not that simple, basically.
Yeah.
And I think that sort of thing often takes generations, right? But, the thing is, it's like individuals change, right? Like, you'll find people who hold a certain point of view, gain some new information, hear what turns out to be to them a compelling argument, and change their mind. Right? This is a thing people do. But I think actually, especially like the more that there's a large group of people thinking a given thing or disbelieving another thing, there's like some sort of like critical mass there almost, and like an individual needs to reach, I don't know, like mental escape velocity in order to kind of like escape the gravitational pull of that, collective belief. So I think like every time one person changes their mind, it makes it easier for another person, but it's hard.
Well, yes and no. And here the Ba Sing Se metaphor breaks down a little bit because in Ba Sing Se, you literally can't leave. But I think what happens in our own world a lot of times is when your mind changes, it doesn't actually change the balance of how many people believe differently in that community because often you just leave the community. And
that's true. That's a really good point.
The other thing that I think is really interesting about this as well, and again, I think it speaks to this, is all throughout the second season, we've been visiting communities that are in the Earth Kingdom, some of which are conquered by the Fire Nation, some of which have been just like barely keeping the Fire Nation at bay. And they're all fairly miserable communities. They're often very poor. They're often destitute. They're often, being, kind of basically put into slave labor by the Fire Nation, or just they're, places that are just sick of the war because they've been, fought over so many times and lots of like the people have died in the war, or, that they're very poor communities because of everything that's happened. And then Ba Sing Se is clearly the most comfortable part of the Earth Kingdom. The people there are happy and healthy, and they're not in constant danger, as long as they don't, commit thought crime, basically. And there's a definite degree of economic stratification and a very severe class system and caste system. But even there, like the poor of Ba Sing Se seems so much better off than the poor of a lot of other cities, a lot of other places that we see in the show. Did you get that same impression? And what's your kind of take on what that part of the story is telling us?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Ba Sing Se is sort of like a refuge of the Earth Kingdom, the Earth Kingdom. And they, like, I can understand why they started doing what they're doing, right? Like, they want to wall it off from the outside world. They want to maintain order within the inside, I guess. It seems like, I guess that outer wall, between the outer wall and the second wall, it's mostly farmland, right? That's where they get most of their food, I guess. So they can withstand a siege indefinitely because they grow all their food in there. So it's not like they need people from the outlying, the farmers from the outlying areas to, it's not like they need to get out of the walls in order to continue existing. It is very stratified. But yeah, it seems like the poor people in Ba Sing Se in the short term are definitely safer than than the nobles, even than the rich people or whatever in the other areas. Although, the area that Toph is from seems kind of without much external struggle, right?
Right.
I'm not super confident in my grasp of like the geography of where all these different places are. They don't do that Indiana Jones thing where they like show a red line on a map or something of where they're
Yeah.
going. I would really like that. But
there is actually a great map that's been
well,
published.
once they
that
do,
I believe
yeah.
That there's a great map, I believe, that has been
locations.
published that's been declared canon that shows all the different journeys, including and it shows Aang's journey on season 1, Zuko's journey in season 1, their journey in season 2, their journey in season 3, and then also all of the life-changing field trips with Zuko. So yeah, I'll post the show notes. It's a great map.
Yes, I will enjoy that. But so anyway, there are areas that have been less affected, but then it seems like not that far from them, there's other areas where it's like, they've been heavily affected, or they've been, their areas have been destroyed even. And so, aside from fear of like damage to one's cabbages, I think within the walls of Ba Sing Se, like, people feel safe and their lives are, they've essentially been protected from what's happening to the rest of the Earth Kingdom, perhaps at the expense of the people living in the rest of the Earth Kingdom.
Right. And I think that's my point, is to me what it really speaks to is, if your government is telling you everything is okay and everything is fine, but you're suffering, like, that's the kind of thing that breeds foment, because it makes people feel like no one knows I'm suffering. They're lying to us. We need to like go out in the streets and we need to like make our voices heard to let people know things aren't okay. And I think that's exactly what is happening in this country right now. But in Ba Sing Se, people are okay. Things are good. Yeah. And I think one of the real lessons of history is it's hard to question things when things feel comfortable. And when someone else comes along and says, no, things aren't okay, they're a lot worse than you think, let's shake the bars here, people are like, well, but that doesn't sound comfortable. That doesn't sound safe.
Right.
And
it's like, well, how's that going to change my life?
Yeah. And kind of bouncing around to a completely different fandom, but I think it really fits here, is it to me really speaks to what the movie The Matrix is actually trying to say with the whole red pill, blue pill thing.
Yeah.
And I'll just say a moment to dunk on, a movie that is written and directed by 2 trans women about that experience to some extent. And like the fact that it's become a right-wing metaphor is horrifying to me. But the actual meaning of that scene of
what? Oh, jeez.
Are you being sarcastic or?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I don't really meme very much. Like, I like the idea of that movie becoming somehow it's just, but that's how it works. That's like somehow people can watch V for Vendetta, right? By the same
Wachowski sisters,
but, and they can like think that they should therefore rise up against the tyranny of like,
political correct culture.
Yeah. Sorry, I just needed a moment. Anyway, continue.
No, it's true. And just for those of us who we every now and then get poked for not being accurate in our claimings of things. V for Vendetta is obviously written originally as a comic book, not by the Wachowskis, but it was turned into
graphic novel. Yeah.
Graphic novel. Yes, thank you. But I believe they were very instrumental in turning. I think they directed, or one of them directed. I'm not sure.
They at least produced the movie.
Right. But the point that I'm making is like what they're explaining in that movie is that, living in the Matrix is quite comfortable. Living outside of the Matrix is horrible. In the Matrix, you get to have good food. Outside of the Matrix, you have gruel. In the Matrix, you feel relatively safe as long as you kind of, don't ask too many questions and keep your nose clean. Outside of the Matrix, you're constantly being hunted and constantly in danger. And I feel like that's part of what the Ba Sing Se story is also getting at, is that if you have, and mostly what we're talking about here is privilege, like if you're in a comfortable position, if your life isn't that hard, it's really easy to just be like, why do we have to stir up trouble, And I, like I was saying at the beginning, I'm really feeling that here, because I feel like, not that I'm going to stir up trouble, that's who I am, but like I'm living in this area and I don't have any idea what my neighbors are actually thinking. I can't talk to them because of the pandemic. But I can easily imagine someone here being like, you know what, my life is pretty comfortable. Why do we have to get, all worked up about these things that aren't affecting me? And I think that's I think it's one more of the ways in which the Bossing Stay story is really insightful, because, it's one more way I can understand why the citizens don't want to listen to people who are saying everything's wrong, because from their perspective, everything's fine.
Yeah, I mean, most people would rather keep taking the blue pill,
Yeah.
Or I guess a better way to put it is it's just easier to take the blue pill. And changing things when things are like pretty okay for you is hard, and it just doesn't happen so much, right?
And I think it's easy to take the blue pill, and it's also really easy to not even realize you're taking the blue pill.
Yeah, totally.
Totally. I think, you look at world history, like the number of people who have said, my life is really comfortable, my life is really good, things are doing okay, I'm going to do some deep explorations and ask questions about the fundamental nature of our system and if it's just or not, is pretty damn small. You have to either be really aware of the fact that things aren't okay because they're not okay for you and your community, or you have to have had some profound experience of understanding the suffering of others,
Yeah.
And inside the walls of Bossing Say, they were able to prevent that.
And further, the small number of people who can come to that sort of on their own, right, without actually having to have the personal suffering, or maybe even not having to have a conversation with someone who is suffering, but to be able to just look and say, wow, that's profound suffering. I don't accept that. I want to change things. The number of people who are just going to like organically come to that conclusion is just not enough to change things, really.
Yeah.
It can be enough to maybe start to spark change and help other people come to that conclusion, right? But it's just not going to, I don't want to say not going to move the needle, but it's not going to result in systemic change, right? Yeah. What has to happen is large numbers of people, especially people with power, right? And a large number of people has a lot of power collectively. A small number of people can have a large amount of power, more individually or as a group. And so in order to really get huge changes, you need a large number of people. I mean, especially large, change against things that are instituted by a small number of people. You really need a very large number of people to come around to that viewpoint. And, one thing that can do that, one reason that I am hopeful that, 10, 20 years from now, hopefully, we'll be in a better place with a lot of these things. Because I don't think it's going to be like next year, like, oh, everything's better,
Yeah.
Maybe there will be some improvements, but there's such economic disparity right now. There's so much income inequality, so much wealth inequality, as much as there has been in the United States, at least since the 1920s.
Right.
You look at what happened after the 1920s. Well, there was kind of a revolution in the United States. That's when you actually started getting social programs that were helping people. That's when you got FDR and the New Deal. And, you look at the French Revolution and there was huge income inequality, and, the nobles or whatever were basically like, oh, they were living in Bossing Say, until they weren't.
Yeah. Well, I think part of what it comes to me as well is that often this is one of, I think, the best things protests can do is, and I'm you get into, I think a lot of times once people start talking about protests that aren't just sort of, peaceful marches, it's very easy to start demonizing it and say, oh, looting and violence and things like that. And I think that there's all sorts of, again, you want to talk about like information that is being very shaped. Depending on where you sit, you can hear radically different versions of what is happening in terms of the looting and violence and where it's starting and who's starting it. And I'm definitely much more on the, that the police have been the often the ones who are doing the most violence. And I think a lot of the country's coming around to that. Pat Robertson recently spoke out against Donald Trump being so law and order. And I did not ever think Pat Robertson would be my ally in something.
That takes like a quintuple take.
Yeah. But I've also seen articles that are very much like, every single person who's ever thrown a brick has been, a white separatist who's trying to,
right. Which
I think
isn't true.
That's just as uninformed, but also not really helpful, because it denies the fact that there is real anger and there is real sort of reason why people are lashing out. And my point is, if we can kind of put aside the debate about, like, is looting this particular store okay and not that store okay, and violence against this person or that person, I think that it's such a nuanced situation. I think we can be sort of generally like, we don't want violence, but we understand where it comes from. Mm-hmm. The point, though, that I'm making with this is that one of the best ways to make change is to make the people inside Ba Sing Se uncomfortable.
Exactly.
I forget who said it, but it's a phrase that I often heard when I was studying to be a pastor, especially, the idea of speaking out for justice, was that the role of a pastor or the role of a leader, a community leader, or whoever it is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable.
Yeah.
And I love that, especially that last phrase, to afflict the comfortable, because part of what it's saying is, if your comfort is based on someone else's suffering or your denial of someone else's suffering, then you need to be made aware of that. And that I think a lot of the protest idea, especially with the no justice, no peace, is like, no, we're not going to let you live in your nice, comfortable world while we're being shot by cops, or while we are, not getting health care, not getting economic rights, or whatever it is. And you can say, like, but is that a kind of legitimate political strategy? But then the question becomes, well, but how else do you reach someone when they are in that place of comfort that Fox News sounds fine and they never have to ask the questions? So it's, and it's interesting to me that we never get that story, but it does make me wonder, like, would I think you can't do that because they didn't want the story to end here. And I think you're right. Like, if they did really, like, convince all of Ba Sing Se that there's a war here, then the Earth Kingdom just kicks the Fire Nation's butt. I think that's the end of the story. I'll
push back on that a little bit. Like, I don't think they're necessarily, like, if everyone in Ba Sing Se, like, turns against the Fire Nation, that they're necessarily going to just, like, defeat the Fire Nation.
Right. I think it means, like,
the Fire Nation seems really strong and very warlike. Like, they've been building war machines for a century.
I think the point is that you don't get to have Aang be quite the me against everyone hero that the story winds up playing out as.
Yes, that's true.
And
you need, this is part 2 out of 3, so it's got to end on a down note, yada yada yada.
Exactly.
I get it.
But I do feel like that what we watch is Aang and Katara and Sokka, fail in terms of bringing they convince the king, but they never quite convince the rest of the leadership, and so the leadership turns on them, and the people never rise up. And the part of me that wonders, would a better way to do that have been, to find some way to make the people of Ba Sing Se not as comfortable, and to show them that, and here's, I think, the problem that protest movements always have, though, is that if, Sokka and Katara and Aang ran around Ba Sing Se and broke things and stopped all the traffic and did everything they could to make things terrible, they might be saying, we're doing this so you realize that things aren't comfortable for everyone else. But the easiest result is to be like, oh, those people aren't making us comfortable. Let's get rid of those people, and then everything can go back.
Right. Yeah, it's like, get out of our way, you meddlesome kids.
Yeah, like, exactly. Yeah. I like combining the anti-protesters with Scooby-Doo villains there.
Yeah, I mean, of course.
That's a pretty wonderful mixing of metaphors there.
Well, Scooby-Doo's all about denying what's going on, right? Isn't it?
Yeah. I have a couple of other big things about the whole plot arc that I want to bring up, but I've been kind of leading the conversation. For you, what's another aspect of this that you think is important to talk about?
Since you brought up, like, the Earth King and him changing his mind, I think sort of the fallacious idea that if you just, change the mind of a leader of a movement, everybody behind it will just, like, follow lockstep all the time. Or if you, a lot of people in the U.S. think, oh, well, if you just remove the president, then everything's going to change, right? Like, no, everything's not going to change. Some things will change. Like the Earth King, like, he's the king and he can make decrees and stuff, but, like, he changes his mind, and then, the Dai Li, I think, get taken over by Azula and her friends, and then they basically just make it a Fire Nation city, but it's just by changing whoever's ostensibly in power or removing them, it just doesn't mean that everything's going to change all of a sudden, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, really, it is bringing change in the mindset to the masses, to the large number of people. Or, you know, if they don't have any power, then maybe towards all the people sort of in power. Like, if you change the minds of all the Dai Li agents, right? Like, then maybe you could actually affect change in Ba Sing Se. But but it takes more than just like, oh, we'll just go to the king and then everything will be okay. It's like, no, not so easy.
One thing that I think about when you talk about this fallacious idea that if we just change the leaders' minds that everything will be okay, I think of someone like Shepard Smith. You know, Shepard Smith was a Fox News anchor, and he, you know, I think to some extent he was never quite as conservative as some of the people on the neighborhood on the network. But he, over time, really kind of evolved about a lot of things. If I'm remembering correctly, he came out as being gay and spoke out about homophobia. But he also spoke out, you know, and especially in recent years, he was very critical of Trump. And I remember thinking, like, oh, you know, he's speaking to the Fox News audience. They'll believe him. But, you know, that blue pill was strong enough that I think Fox listeners were able to go, like, okay, nope, he changed his mind, so now he's wrong.
Right, yeah. He's a traitor to, like, basically whatever we have been told. Yeah.
And for a while, I think he was able to kind of stick around the network to be like, hey, look, no, we're balanced. And then just, you know, kind of shuffled off. And I'm focusing mostly on Fox News. I don't think that, you know, the network has, I think, a huge amount of problems. I think there are some people there who are trying to tell good stories of journalism, but overwhelmingly, I think it has a very negative journalistic bent. I don't mean to make it the only example, but I think it's the easiest one for us to talk about. And to me, I think what's most important there is it's this idea that once that kind of mind of thinking has become strong enough, it doesn't matter who the leader is. You know, you can, because any person can immediately be tossed aside. It reminds me of a story that I've heard, and at first I thought this was true. I think at this point that it's apocryphal, but whether it actually happened, I think I can believe that it would happen, and I believe it's fairly insightful. The story is that sometime in the 60s, as a way of kind of like demonstrating, like, you know, the problem with all these kind of cults and stuff like that, and wanting to do kind of like an experiment on this, that a guy basically started a cult, and he wound up getting, like, you know, a bunch of followers. I think some were like, you know, 500 or 600 or maybe even more than that. And then after building this up for like 5 or 10 years, you know, never a huge one, enough to kind of attract national attention, but, you know, a significant cult. He basically got them all together and gave a speech and said, this was all a lie. This was, you know, none of this actually happened. And, you know, none of this is true. All the cult stuff that I taught you, I made up all of it. There was never any kind of, you know, talking sunflower or whatever the heck it was that he based the whole cult on. And the way that the fable ends is that they decided he was, you know, wrong and either drove him out or killed him and continued on for a period of time after that. Right. You know, I think at this point that the idea that actually happened is probably pretty fanciful, but I could believe it happening. I could, I mean, like, I'm a Christian, and I certainly think that that's kind of what happened to Jesus. You know, like,
word.
There's an old story that, you know, if Jesus came back today, like, you know, most Christians would just call him a pinko commie traitor, you know? Yeah. So it's, I think is another good point of that. You can't rely just on the leader, and that I think in some ways is the biggest mistake Aang and all that's going to make, is they think if we just convince the king, everything will be okay, but it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's like in Return of the Jedi, like to get a little Star Wars plug in here. You know, like Vader tosses the Emperor down a hole, and like then they blow up the Death Star, and then like everything's fine, right? And at the end of the movie, it's like, everything's fine, because, you know, it's the end of a trilogy, and I kind of like that ending. It feels, you know, like a satisfying conclusion.
Though I want the Ewoks to sing in my ending, god damn it.
Yub nub for life.
Yub nub for life.
But like, you know, at the, you know, but then the post-Quel trilogy, like, without the Emperor around and without Vader around, basically the Empire comes back. And then, the Emperor, anyway, they kind of jacked it up. There was something there, and I actually don't love the evolution of the plot. And we don't really know what happens between Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens. The Mandalorian is maybe telling us some of that story, but the point being, the head of the emperor is gone. He has no successor, right?
Yep.
Which kind of makes it a little questionable as a form of government. I mean, what did he think was going to happen? Oh, his plan was to live forever. That's right. Never mind.
Yeah.
It's reasonable.
I mean, he was the most mustache twirly of mustache twirly villains of all time.
Ever. Yes, for sure. But the point is the ideals, such as they were, persisted, right? And that is very realistic.
And I think, honestly, one of the things that The Mandalorian The Mandalorian explains the thing that the sequels never quite explain, which is that part of the reason why some people miss the Empire and maybe wind up turning towards the First Order is that Republic isn't really bringing stability and safety and comfort.
Right,
that things are crazy and chaotic. And I feel like that, in some ways, that's the thing that I've never liked about Star Wars, that I always think Star Wars gets wrong, is it buys so much into the great man of history idea that it's if you just, like in even at the end of the Rise of Skywalker, the whole rest of the First Order is still out there, aren't they? That hasn't changed. Right. You have to change, and I think you have to change ideas, and that's, to me, if Trump died tomorrow, which I am in no way advocating for. I don't want police to come to our door. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, listen to an older episode where we talk about Lex Luthor being president and Superman killing him. And but what is probably just a coincidence, the police knocked on Paul's door in the middle of our recording that episode.
Totally a coincidence.
We've been a little careful about that ever since. But if Trump died tomorrow, the 40 million people who are, support him are still going to be just as racist and just as desiring for a, let's kill all the liberals kind of idea. And I'm going to be careful with words here. I'm not saying that all people who vote for Trump are, that far off, that far gone onto being that explicitly racist. That's not what I'm saying. But that there is a hardcore group who very much clearly is. And it's those people who, and I think it's around 35, 40 million who just nothing Trump can do will ever make them disapprove of him. And again, we found that Pat Robertson isn't even in that category.
Right. He's not in that. Yeah.
But that's a whole other story. But yeah, I think that there's an important message here about you do have to change hearts and minds. If everybody thinks you're the enemy, you have to defeat them, but then you have to do something to convince them you're not the enemy anymore. And I think that's I'll say Matthew Carroll, who has been the podcast host of the MCU Cast and the Stranded Panda Network that this is all part of, and he and I did an episode that went up last week, if everything is gone as it should be, where we talked a lot about the Floyd moment, and that's something that he pushes a lot, is the idea that you have to not just, fight the evil, you can't just demonize everybody on the other side. And while he and I disagree on some extent, I think he has helped me better see that I think this show is getting at, that if you walk in thinking all these people in Ba Sing Se are stupid and wrong, and we just have to take over their leadership, nothing's gonna ever change.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, to put a, I guess a finer point on what you were saying about if Trump died tomorrow, Trumpism wouldn't, right? I mean, fascism in Germany fell when Hitler, died, right?
Right.
I mean, not necessarily immediately, but
20 million Soviet soldiers also helped with that. Because that's the thing, is I think
right. Yeah.
I think that if in 1940, Hitler died as part of Nazism dying. But I think if some sniper had gotten in there and, shot Hitler in 1941, Goebbels takes over and does the same things,
I mean, but my point was that was a military defeat also. I mean, and it wasn't Hitler died, and then they surrendered. It's like he killed himself because they were losing, right?
Yeah.
But my point is fascism did not die.
Yeah.
Fascism was immediately. I mean, it was still going on in Spain, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you had Franco there, and I would argue that America was infected with it.
Yeah. I mean, and certainly, like, in Germany, they did a very concerted effort to try and do reconciliation, and to move the whole country past that. And it made some great strides. I think, as we're being seen there, it's not completely stamped out. South Africa, to me, is another place where they really tried to do this, where they really tried to be like, how, having Nelson Mandela win an election doesn't change the fact that, millions of white people have been raised to think that black people are animals and can't ever be trusted with political power. And so they had to change the culture.
Yeah.
And I think season 3 actually does I never actually kind of made this connection before. And I probably say this on every episode of Superhero Ethics at this point, is that I don't know whether the writers are actually quite as brilliant as I think about it, or I'm just drawing connections that they never intended. But Avatar is so good and so subtle that I think this was intentional. They spend so much of season 3 getting to know Fire Nation people and getting to understand Fire Nation people and getting to humanize Fire Nation people. In one major plot point through, the redemption in a very long, drawn out arc of a particular character, but also just, the numerous times they go to a Fire Nation village and think of them as the enemy and come to realize, like, maybe these people are against the Fire Lord, or maybe even they're for the Fire Lord, but they're still decent people. And that they could be reached in that way.
Yeah, well, so I think this is an area where you're not headcanoning anything. I think it is very explicitly in the show, and I think it is very deliberate. And I think they were setting it up from the beginning, where, even in season 1, there's a firebender who left the Fire Nation, right? Who starts to teach Aang firebending. Doesn't go so hot, but
no fun, Neo Hotman.
Hotman. Yeah, but the arc of this one character. Are we going to talk about him? Or are we not going to talk about him?
Yeah, we can. Again, we're about to spoil something pretty big. But yeah, the character we're talking about is Zuko.
Fire Nation Prince Zuko.
I will also say I came very close to doing it just now because I am a big Grease fan. I will always think of him as Danny Zuko. And so I have to keep reminding myself. I was literally about to say, like, is Danny Zuko? I was like, no, he's not Danny Zuko. He is Prince Zuko.
Yeah, Prince Zuko. And I think his arc in a way is, to me, what kind of makes the series work at the end.
Yes.
It's and it is kind of what we're talking about, is that, I mean, sure, like, Aang can defeat the Fire Lord, and then the Fire Nation's army can be defeated, but it's like, well, then what, right? Like, are you just going to occupy this nation? Like, are you going to, like, what are you going to do? And Zuko's personal journey from, the beginning being just like, I must regain my honor, I must capture the Avatar, to, being Fire Nation, Lord of the Fire Nation, basically, Fire Lord, Zuko. He's able to go on this whole journey himself, and he can lead the Fire Nation as a member of the Fire Nation who's gone on this personal journey, and he can try and take, the nation itself, the culture itself, on this journey, kind of really more back to its roots,
right,
before it became this imperialist power, because it for hundreds of years, for however long before that, it existed peacefully with the other, nations.
Right. And I think there always was, like, an aspect to which the Fire Nation was a little bit more volatile and a little bit more militaristic,
fire.
Perhaps. Yeah, because that's the nature of fire. But that the idea is that was in balance with everything else, that it wasn't the Fire Nation itself is evil.
And early on, we just see their military. That's all we see for, like, the first 2 seasons.
Yeah.
Except for maybe a character here or a character there, is just the military of the Fire Nation. So, like, we get this picture of them that they are their military, And then in season 3, they take us into the Fire Nation. It's like, oh, there is no war in the Fire Nation. I mean, it's different. It's different there. There's people. Yeah. There's always people.
I think about this in particular because I have a friend who we chat online from time to time, and she lives in Texas, and she's moderate on some issues, pretty liberal on some others, but certainly not like when you think of like the stereotype that a lot of leftists have that I think I certainly had for a while, and still do to some extent, but she's really helped turn me around on it. Of like, oh, a Texan, so like super racist, super white, very much a Trump supporter, etc. And she's really kind of helped remind me of like that might be the Texas government, and that might be the majority of people whose votes are counted in Texas elections. But it is not all people in Texas by any means, and it's certainly not the majority of Texas. It might not be the majority of people in Texas, given all the crazy ways that elections are counted these days in America, and who votes in America. And so, I think that lesson of like the humanizing of the people behind the curtain becomes super important. This isn't quite connected to that, but I just need to kind of say it just on the Danny Zuko, not Danny Zuko. Fuck, I just did it. Geez. The Zuko redemption arc. So much of his struggle is about what it means to find his honor, and him eventually kind of letting go of that idea. And I just think that's funny because I'm, for my other podcast, currently doing a rewatch of the TV show The Clone Wars, which has a lot of great points. And Paul and I just did a rewatch of the last season, which is very good, I think. The Clone Wars, I mean, the shows. I hope our podcast is good too, but I'm not being quite that arrogant.
Yeah, it's all of it's very good.
And I think all the Clone Wars TV show is pretty good and has some very high points and some low points. And one of them was there's an episode. They always start with this what seems supposed to be like kind of an inspirational quote, as Riki Hayashi, one of my co-hosts on the other one, pointed out that often they can't be told that you can't tell the difference between them and fortune cookie slogans.
It's a collection of aphorisms.
Yeah, and so one of the slogans of the episode I was watching today is, "It's the quest for honor that makes someone honorable." And I was just kind of like, my friend Zuko might have some words to say to you about that. Because so much of his story is like his quest for honor is what makes him dishonorable.
Right. I mean, it's almost more like the rejection of the quest for honor is what brings honor. I mean...
Yeah, it's that whole thing of like, if you set out in the world being like, I am going to be a good person, you're almost definitely not. Like you can try, but often it's that like, when you're so focused on like, I want to be a good person, that's too strong. I think it's possible, but I think it's very easy for it then to become about, is it that you want to be a good person, or is it that you want to feel like you're a good person, or is it that you want other people to think you're a good person? Because it's easy to mix up the second two for that first one, and the second two can lead you to some pretty bad places. And just to bounce around for all the but just to bounce around for all the fandoms we're mentioning, if you don't quite understand this, listen to the song "I'm a Good Person, a Real Good Person" from Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. Because wow, is it a good illustration of this?
And then you will live long and prosper.
Exactly.
So. Just because you said you were going to get all the fandoms, but I think the trouble comes in. So like the idea of honor, right? That it's like on one level the idea is supposedly that you do honorable things and you are honorable, and that you do honorable things not because they bring you benefit. But because they're just like, it's like following your code, kind of, I think, right? But like the whole idea of honor, it's like, well, there's an extent to which it's like reputation, right? Where it's like essentially doing something for honor is doing it for your reputation. Whereas, if you were to look at it another way, it would be, the struggle for honor or something is essentially the struggle for protecting your reputation or redeeming your reputation.
Right.
But, if you looked at it more sort of introspectively as like, the struggle for honor is basically to do what like there's like almost the opposite thing can be regarded as honor, which is like to do what is right regardless of what the rewards are, right? And like
there's a great saying, I don't remember the exact wording, but yeah, will you do the right thing when no one is watching?
Exactly, and that's like the honorable thing essentially, right? Like and so those things are almost kind of at cross purposes. I will say, just to on the subject of honor, it actually isn't, but it kind of is. My dad was born in Texas, and he was extremely liberal. His parents were extremely liberal, and you know, and both of their kids were. Well, one of their kids still is, and you know, like being born in Texas or living in Texas a long time. You know, it's like that just wasn't all the people there, right? Yeah. Like during the Civil War, like Texas joined the Confederacy, but like not all Texans were like, yeah, let's do that, right? It's like we see these states painted red and blue on a map, and it's really easy to go, oh, that's a Fire Nation state. Oh, that's a Waterbender state, right? You know, if you just only think in Avatar terms, but like. That's not how it works. Like, there's a third of California voted for Trump, right? Like, a third of Georgia voted for, maybe it was more, voted for Clinton. You know, it's like a large amount of Texas. Like
a majority of Georgia voted for Stacey Abrams.
Well, there's that. Exactly. It's probably a lot more than a third that voted for Clinton. The point being that, like, in every area, there's people who think one thing and people who think another thing, and you can't just say, oh, that person is from that area, they probably think that. You can say, yeah, they probably think this, right. And, like, from a statistical standpoint, that's a fair statement to, you know, but you can't say they probably think this, therefore I will assume it. You should never assume that things are probable are true, right. Simply that they are more likely to be true.
Well, and I think it also gets, because I think the danger, I feel like we're kind of like walking a narrow path between a couple of different extremes, because to some extent, I think we're backing away a little bit from, you know, what some of the left, I think, sometimes goes to, of just, you know, like all these people are terrible and awful. But I also think that it's easy to therefore go to, you know, everyone is good at heart. We just have different perspectives, and we all just need to sit down and talk to each other. And I'm not able to go quite that far, because I do, but it's more, I think, that there's able to be different degrees, you know, that like
of course,
I'm frustrated with a person who has never read anything except the things that are lying to them. But I'm a lot more frustrated with the person who's actually lying to them. You know, like and I think it's okay to have degrees like that, and to say like there's a thing that went around today that I thought was powerful, but I also wanted to push back on, which was saying, you know, if you have 12 bad cops and 1,300 cops who are silent, you have 1,312 bad cops. And on the one hand, I really like that idea, because I do think that there's something to say of like, you can't be part of an organization and say, oh, it's not our fault, there are just some bad apples, but that doesn't make all of us bad, if you're not actively speaking out against those bad apples. And especially when, in the case of the police department, so often it's the people who aren't the truly bad ones are helping and protecting the ones who really are. So I just feel like, yeah, you know, if you've got 1,300 silent cops, you know, being silent in the face of those 12 really bad cops, you do have 1,312, you know, cops who I have trouble saying like these are good people. But that's still,
you have 1,312 cops who are not doing the right thing,
right? In
this case,
but that still means that 12 of those cops are significantly worse than the other 1,300. You know, and I feel like we need to have that degree of, and as well as the understanding of like, to some extent, outside of those 12, it's not that I need to say that every member of that 1,300 is bad. It's that the organization that those 1,312 all belong to is fundamentally bad. And so I have some judgment on the person who stays in that organization. But I also have to understand, like, some of the people who stay in that organization do so because they think there's no racism in Ba Sing Se. You know, they have... And I liked what you said at the very beginning about willful ignorance. And I kind of feel like if you're on the police department and you're able to kind of like... You know, I don't think it is possible... When I keep saying, like, I have sympathy for the people who've never been exposed to the idea that there is war outside Ba Sing Se,
Yeah.
I don't think you. I think if you have watched that video, you have lost the ability to claim that everything is fine. I think that once we get to a point where and so that the degree to which I'm tolerant of things are not in terms of willful ignorance becomes a lot harder.
Yeah.
I want to though then tie this back to the Ba Sing Se conversation. We've already kind of done so, but I want to actually pick up. I want to kind of go back to something we were saying about Zuko that we thought was a tangent, and actually say why I think it really ties in well to this, and it very much ties in, I think, to America and the cops, which is the idea of honor. Because I think one of the things I was struck by as I was rewatching it is that within Ba Sing Se, one of the things that they actually talk about is the honor of the Earth Kingdom and the glory of the Earth Kingdom, and that the Earth Kingdom is wonderful, and that part of what they say that they don't want to mention the war here. What's never mentioned, but I think is the very strong subtext, is we don't want to mention that we're losing.
Right.
Ba Sing Se is a great place to say, like, here we can hold on to the and I think it's a question of honor. I think it's that idea of, we are proud to be Earth Kingdom people. And it's hard to do that when the Fire Kingdom has been kicking your butt for the last 100 years.
Right. I mean, especially because they're like Earth, right? Stubborn, like
right.
Firm, right? Standing their ground, basically.
Yeah.
And, like, they've been pushed back.
And I think that's, what was Trump's literal campaign slogan? Make America great again, And to me, I think that it's all about restoring America's honor and restoring the idea that America is still a great country. And a big part of that has been, the Europeans don't think we're great. Well, screw them. We should never have listened to them at the beginning. The World Health Organization is critical of what we do. Let's leave the World Health Organization. Let's leave the UN.
Right.
And I think it's that same idea. And even when it comes to cops, I can understand that when you're 18 years old and you've always believed that cops are these, brave men in blue who protect you. And that's a very honorable position. New York City, they're called, New York's finest.
Right.
I think you can believe that there's an awful lot of honor in being a cop. And to then learn that you've given your life and you have risked your life for a profession that you think is honorable. And now a whole bunch of people are saying the profession is racist, the profession is wrong, the profession maybe isn't needed, or, that you're a terrible person for being a part of that profession, which I'm not, I think there's a lot of truth in a lot of those statements. But I can also understand why a person goes like, shit, no, I'm a cop. Being a cop is honorable. You can't forget that. And that's where a lot of the, Blue Lives Matter nonsense comes from. And as I said, even Pat Robertson going this far, it's gone from leftist, blogs to the New York Times and the Baltimore Sun and the National Review, the Business Insider, which is hardly a conservative publication, saying, listen, it's been the cops that have been driving this violence. And I think, I think part of it is because it's that idea of, they want to believe there's no racism in Ba Sing Se. There's no racism in the police department. And when now that's challenged, they're fighting back pretty hard.
Yeah, some. And that's the thing, is that, again, it's important to look at, a group as not a monolith.
Right.
Right? The question is, like, what do you do when that's what your department is basically saying to do? How many of these attacks by police on now, like, on peaceful protesters, on journalists, how many of them are policy and how many of them are like instinct?
Yeah.
Right. How many of them are a hothead, like inciting something or inflaming something, and how many of them are a police chief or captain or whatever saying we're going to go out there and we're going to crack some skulls or whatever. And I don't know, no one does, right? But there are other places where a police chief or a police captain has said, we are going to, put down our riot gear and we're going to march with you. Here in Santa Rosa, the police chief was like, I'm going to take a knee with the protesters. And then, and then they have a curfew and they're going to enforce the curfew. And I don't know exactly how that's gone.
Yeah.
And
there have definitely been some places where the cops made nice gestures and then were tear gassing people an hour later.
That too.
But that's not, but you're right. That doesn't,
but that doesn't mean that's always the way it's gone. Like, But the point is it's like it's like it seems like you can't, like, without speaking out against it, you're complicit, right? Especially if you're in the profession, and especially if you're on that particular force. There've been cops who've spoken out and then they get fired, and like maybe that's the thing you're supposed to do, right? Maybe you're supposed to resign. I don't.
And here I'll say, I do think that not enough cops are trying to do the good thing, and that's part of why I look at the president of the Minneapolis Police Union has been very protective of I just saw his name a second ago. Has been very protective of Derek Chauvin, the man who murdered George Floyd.
Which is insane.
And and the thing is, he's elected, and he has this isn't a first thing for him. He has been saying he said some time ago that he thinks of policing like basketball, and like a good basketball player should get called for some fouls. It means that they're doing their best, and so he's basically saying it's okay if you get called for some brutality charges. That's a man who's chosen by the Minneapolis Police Department to represent them.
And so elected by the officers.
Yeah, I think he's elected. I'm not sure exactly, but he's certainly supposed to be their spokesperson.
Right.
Does that mean that every single person who, every single cop, well, certainly it doesn't mean that every single person who voted for him maybe knew all of that, and probably a lot of people didn't vote for him. So again, it's that each individual you got to see differently. You said earlier also, we're jumping all over the place because this is all this is so connected, and again, it's what makes Avatar such a good show, is how it ties into all this. But you were making the point of when a cop does something terrible, are they acting on instinct, or is that how they were trained? And I think most of the
or following direct orders,
right? Yeah. And I think sometimes they are following direct orders, and I would like to see more cops, standing up and saying no, I'm not going to tear gas those people. I think certainly the orders to tear gas are direct orders. But I also think that there's a combination of the two, which is where, how do your instincts work when you've been trained? If you see movement there, it's the enemy, fire, or you haven't, you've been trained in ways. There's been a lot of evidence that a lot of the way cops are trained is to see a dark-skinned person as more of a threat. And that's often just the bias that's inherent and how that all happens. It certainly all ties together. Where it all comes down, though, for me is I am a person who wants the people of Ba Sing Se to do more, especially when I feel like they don't have the ability to be that ignorant. And I want more cops to stand up. But I also think that I don't always know what a cop fighting for justice is going to look like because I'm not inside there. And here I'm going to draw a comparison that I think people on both the right and the left might yell at me for, but I think it somewhat fits. I have often said that, it is very easy if you don't have a boot on your throat to be critical of how the person who does have a boot on their throat is trying to get the boot off their throat, But, the boot isn't on my throat. And so it's part of how I feel about the violent protests is I sort of feel like I don't experience the rage and the terror of having lived under the threat of police violence my entire life and seeing it happen and seeing the rest of the country go, oh, that's terrible, # Black Lives Matter, and move on. And so, I don't have that boot on my throat. And I might have thoughts about strategy, and I actually have been coming around to the idea that actually, there's a lot of strategy in riots. And, we're celebrating Pride Month. Pride started because of a riot. But even putting that aside, it's that feeling of I don't feel like it's my place to judge how someone responds to a situation that I'm not in. Right? That's not entirely fair. I can judge it, but when they're dealing with a fear that I don't have. And in the same way, I don't want to excuse all cops. I don't want to say that all 1,300 of those are good cops. They're just staying silent. If you're staying silent, you're not as good a cop as you think you are. But I do want to say I don't know what it's like to be within a group that thinks of itself as a brotherhood, all of whom are armed, all of whom are willing to use violence to do what they think is important to, protect, and decide to go against them. Because I know that there has been horrible violence done to cops who spoke out and stuff like that. And to me, that doesn't in any way excuse the silence of cops, but I do just want to say and I may be saying this because I hope both sides, that I'm also saying if you're listening to this and you're more on the side of like, Blue Lives Matter, well, I can understand that. I'm very glad you're listening. But I can understand that maybe that there's difficulties in speaking out as a cop that I don't understand, and that I hope that someone who understands that can also then say that maybe there's difficulties in having that boot on your throat that you don't understand, and that maybe that can help you not be so quick to say like, oh, they're fighting for justice in the wrong way.
I mean, I think everyone's well served to whenever anybody does anything to or takes a position, to listen, and to accept the fact that none of us have the same experience exactly as any other one of us, right? I mean, this it's a little bit of like a Clone Wars sort of thing, where, I mean, there's a lot of people have similar experiences in particular ways, right?
Yeah.
And you can say, well, I haven't had that sort of experience. And so I need to listen to what they're saying about that experience. And that doesn't mean that then you have to like co-sign every action they take.
Yeah.
Right. But if you take the time to listen to what someone says about their experience, you'll have a greater understanding, and you can have empathy for them and sort of understand why they're taking the actions they're taking. And if those are actions you oppose, then you're going to have a better chance of trying to somehow find a way to get them to take different actions. Or you're just going to say, okay, look, that's not the way I'd go about it, but, I support what you're trying to do. And even if you're not doing it exactly the way I would like you to do, maybe I'll throw a suggestion out there when the time feels right. But overall, like, I support what you're trying to do, and that doesn't necessarily mean always signing on for everything someone's doing, but I mean, it's harder in the case of, of cops, where it's like, I think most people believe that police are necessary. I don't necessarily strictly believe that. I would call myself an anarchist in a lot of ways, not in wanting to overthrow a government, but just thinking that's not necessarily the only way we can live, is this way. But, there are things that cops are supposed to be doing that most people support, right? And then there are things that cops are doing that most people oppose. Like, murdering people. Because that's one of the things they're supposed to be stopping, that most people want them to stop. And it just becomes, I don't know, it's just very difficult to look at an institution and say, can that change happen from the inside? Like, in an ideal world, right, or in an ideal police department, if there is such a thing, there would be X number of people who probably shouldn't have been cops in the first place. And then there'd be a lot of people who are in it for all the right reasons. And then they'd see those people doing the things that were not what they're supposed to be doing, that are either doing horrible things or just doing things that are kind of like out of line, and being like, like when somebody responds with too much violence that doesn't end in murder, that's probably a good time to be like, you know what? Let's try someone else. Yeah. Maybe you're not right for this. And ideally, that institution would be run mostly by people who are trying to do the right thing and have a temperament suited to that. Right. And then they would sort of police themselves and actually expunge the worst, right? But that's probably not going to happen, at least in most places. And, so then the question is, well, how do you do it from the outside? Right.
And I do think, deciding how to reform the police department is a little bit outside of the purview of the podcast.
Yeah. I was about to say.
Yeah. But I do hear what you're saying. And I think that, I'll say one thing just on what you were just saying, and then get back to the main topic. I'm more on the side of that we need some kind of police force than I think you are.
Sure.
I think though that
that's like 99 point almost everybody else.
I think that there's a lot that we can do though to do major reforms in how it's done and major reforms in how cops are trained. I mean, just as a basic 30 seconds of Googling this guy showed Facebook pictures that were public of him, wearing racist paraphernalia. How about just as a basic, you don't work for, anyway. But what I will say...
Yeah, you're done. Yeah. That's it. Right?
Tying it back to this, I think that part of what this gets into, and I feel like this is such a big part of our politics in general, not just the cop issue, but certainly the cops as well. To me, everything in Ba Sing Se is about defensiveness. It's about, not wanting to acknowledge that things aren't as good as they are. It's about not wanting to admit that we've made mistakes. It's about not wanting to be able to say, and that again, it's kind of like how I really want to actually read all of the Sokovia Accords. I would love to see, the history of Ba Sing Se, and what got them to this point. Cause it's, hard to think it was just, was it just gradual? Or did it happen overnight? Or was it what? And I imagine a lot of that starts with after a major defeat. Or maybe even the flip side, actually, because a major part of the war is that the one major defeat the Fire Kingdom has had was outside the walls of Ba Sing Se, 20 or 30 years ago, when Iroh, before he really kind of had his change of heart, was defeated. Or actually, he wasn't actually even fully defeated.
Think it was 10 or 20. I think it was...
You think it was...
Well, because it was during Zuko's lifetime, right?
Okay, So
it was 5 to 10 years, basically.
Right. But basically, there was a siege for 600 days, and it was clearly... and so part of makes you wonder is that when it changed? Is that they sort of held on to that moment of glory and said, we defeated the Fire Nation, so the war is over. Which to me is kind of...
And then we brainwashed everybody so they didn't know what happened. Or did people even know what was going on? Were there fireballs sailing over the city? Well, we don't know this.
I kind of like that version of it, because what it speaks to me of is we elected Obama, so racism is over. We did this or we did that, and so these other issues are over. So
mission accomplished.
Yeah, exactly. It all just speaks to me about and I'll admit, I'm someone who I imagine both you and Jacob, if he ever listens to this, and a couple other people who try to get me to watch Avatar are kind of grinning a little bit as they listen to me talk about what a good show this is, because for a while I didn't want to watch it. I am someone who generally has real trouble with animated television. Although that has changed, I think in part because of my watching of the show. A couple episodes ago, I
welcome.
did it. Yeah. Well, and that's the thing is, I think you and Jacob really pushed me on it. And a couple episodes ago, I did a review of She-Ra, which is, in a lot of ways, I think is very much kind of like Avatar as written by queer people. Because it's a very similar story. There's a lot of similar dynamics, and it has a lot of the same. It has some of the same kids show cheesiness that I don't like about Avatar either. But even so, I think they're probably at this point both in my top 10 of television shows.
Wow.
And I think for me with Avatar, it's because of things like, I think if there's two things that Avatar most solidifies for me with that, it's the way the Ba Sing Se story is treated, and the way that I keep wanting to say Danny, the way that Prince Zuko is treated. Maybe do we ever actually hear what his first name is? Maybe he's Zuko Danny. Maybe there's a
That's his name.
Yeah.
That's his whole name.
Zuko?
His name is Zuko.
He doesn't have a last name.
Aang doesn't have a last name. Katara doesn't have a last name.
Yeah, I guess that's fair.
He's Zuko, Prince of the Fire Nation.
That's fair.
Son of Ozai.
Yeah, that's fair. It does seem like it's a very, the entire world is made up of maybe 5,000 people, so it's possible that no one has last names.
Right. Grandson or great-grandson of Roku?
Yeah.
Or great-grandson of Roku?
Great-grandson of both Roku and Shinzan.
And Sozin, right?
I thought it was it might be Shozin. And
did you say Shinjo, the outfielder for the Mets?
No. Look,
Their answer to Ichiro, which was a very poor answer to Ichiro.
I already got yelled at on or badly commented on my Star Wars podcast for not pronouncing these right. So I'm just going to ignore that one.
For saying Yawin instead of Yavin.
Okay, it's Yavin. It's Yavin.
Well, I mean, hey, it's not Magneto bad. You know?
I don't think I ever said that, did I?
No, it was a guest.
Okay.
An excellent guest, but he kept saying Magneto, and it really bothered me.
Oh. I think...
But then I think sometimes when it's not like an animation, I'm like, oh, I don't even know how that person's name is pronounced. That's how you know someone read the comics.
Yeah, I did say Palpatine a couple of times.
Oh, yeah, I believe that.
But yeah, it all just goes to show why I think why this show is so good and so insightful. Because I think, honestly, I kind of just want like everybody who's thinking about these issues to sit down and watch this set of episodes, because it just has so much to say about like the dynamics we can get into on all sides, both of like why this is so scary and why this is so terrifying, but also why it's hard to therefore say that, you know, every person who lives in Ba Sing Se is terrible.
Right.
Because it goes in so many different directions.
Yeah, and I mean, one person in Ba Sing Se changing their actions would just result in a visit to Lake Laogai, right? Mm-hmm. It's like it has to be a mass change in Ba Sing Se. And, you know, I think, you know, the whole Ba Sing Se, there is no war in Ba Sing Se is, it's all about denial. Yeah. Right? It's about basically reaffirmation of prior greatness and denial of what's going on in the real world. And I feel that's some of the, you know, the moment we're living through is like, I mean,
make the Earth Kingdom great again.
Exactly. And I mean, there's just so much denial, but it's like there is war in Ba Sing Se. Yeah. Like it's here, and it's, you know, the struggle is real, and you know, I guess people can still, you know, I think about it and I'm like, I guess I could probably just go on, you know, business as usual, mm-hmm. and like ignore what's going on in the world, and that's like often like my deepest wish, to be able to do that, like honestly, and not even just like with what's going on now at all, like just speaking in a larger sense, like I really wish just everything was good, and like I could just focus on, you know, writing stories or whatever, but it's not. And I mean, I personally harbor concerns that, you know, what's going on now is just the very beginning of something bigger, and something, yeah, I don't really want to say worse, but like, I mean, probably worse, but like more broader, and that people aren't really going to be able to just ignore it. And, you know, the fact, you know, if people can't ignore it, like, maybe that's good.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's what this moment has done, is it has brought the war to a lot more Ba Sing Se's. Like, not to keep hitting the metaphor, but I think that's, you know, that's what, and part of that is the intentional action of the protesters, and I think that's a very good thing. But part of it's also because, you know, you can't watch that video without having the wall around you crack a little bit, you know? And in some ways, I think that was one of the most interesting things, was how many people, you know, but it's that sort of like, you know, the thing about Ba Sing Se is that they have many walls. And so you can watch that video and the wall of no cops are racist can crack. But now you can go to the wall of it's just a few bad apples, you know, or it's just, you know, bad shit. Like, it's always, there's always, and I think that's the other thing, is I think like it's easy for those of us who are really pushing for that kind of change to think, okay, once we break down that wall, everything's okay. And that's why Aang lost.
Yeah, it's just not that simple.
Yeah, you're right. It's not that simple. And that's actually a pretty good way to end this, because I think you and I can talk about this till the end of time, but frankly, I think other people have other opinions, and because it's not that simple. And I feel like I was saying actually on the podcast last week that I love media that asks questions and doesn't necessarily give answers. And, you know, I think you and I and every person who's been on this podcast often has some pretty good answers we want to propose, but I don't think we have it all figured out. It's not that simple. And so, listeners, I'd love to hear from you all. What do you think about all this? please write in. Please, you can find us on Facebook or on Twitter at Superhero Ethics. You can email us at superheroethics@gmail.com. You can find both me and Paul on various social media. All those links will be in the show notes. We'd love to hear from you. This is such an important topic, and I think kind of for two ways. A, because we're talking about what I hope that by the time that I read while we were podcasting this that the charges against the Devin have been upgraded to second-degree murder, and that the other 3 officers have all been arrested. So that gives me a little bit more hope that by the time you're listening to this, maybe things will have diffused a little bit and some progress will have been made. But either way, these issues are never going to go away, and Avatar certainly is one we're talking about a lot. So whether you want to talk about either side of that, please write in. Let us know your thoughts. I'd love to keep the conversation going. There's great ways to do that on Facebook and Twitter and places like that. So please also check out some of the other great podcasts we have on the Stranded Panda Network. You can hear, as I said, Matt Carroll and Jeff Randall on my last episode. They do a number of other things, including the MCU cast, Bingers Assemble. Jeff is one of my co-hosts on the Star Wars Universe podcast, which Paul has also been on. Basically, we're just a whole big incestuous people who go on each other's podcasts because we don't have anything better to do because we're all locked down under quarantine. Although I have a full-time job in theory. But so, yeah, please check all those out. I've actually been trying to convince my boss to listen to this, so I'm going to cut out that joke about the full-time job. It's kind of all a big, network of us all helping each other out because during quarantine, a lot of us have a lot more free time. Some of us still have jobs like myself, but we still have the time to do this, and I'm sure you're in the same place. So let us know what you think. Please check out some of those other podcasts. Thank you, Paul, for being a part of this, and have a good day.